guys, today I'm at Gilrose Cemetery, which is the final resting place of the first murder victim who features in today's video. This is a video about another true crime story that again happened in Leicester in the same years as those of Colin Pitchfork, who was another Leicester murderer who featured in an earlier video I made. I will add the link in the description below to Colin Pitchfork video in case you may want to view it. Today's video is about a killer who was just 16 years old when he committed his first murder of a woman by the name of Caroline Osborne, who was aged just 33 years old. Now, Caroline ran a business as a pet beautician in Leicester, and the second murder was committed by this individual 2 years later when he was just 18 years old. Now, I had the unfortunate displeasure of going to the same secondary school, being in the same year at the school and actually living in the next street to this person. He was living with his grandmother in the same house at the time when he committed the first murder of Caroline Osborne in 1983. Now, the second murder occurred in 1985 and was that of a young nurse who was just 21 years old at the time, a woman by the name of Amanda Weedon, who was due to get married just 3 months later before she sadly had her life taken away from her by this satanic killer. The murderer who features in today's video is a man by the name of Paul Bostock. Now, like Colin Pitchfork, Bostock murdered two women. Pitchfork murders were in 1983 and 1986, and Bostock's were in 1983 and 1985. Paul Bostock was born and lived in the City of Leicester. Now, for our European and international audiences, and for those of you who may not know where Leicester is, I've added a map of the City of Leicester to show you where it sits in relation to the UK. Now, in today's video, I shall show you the actual house on Walton Street in the City of Leicester that Paul Bostock lived in at the time when he committed the first murder of Caroline Osborne in 1983, aged just 16 years old. I shall also show you the secondary school Bostock attended at the time of the first murder, and that school was called Westcote Secondary Modern School and is located in the City of Leicester. I shall also visit actual premises that were occupied in 1983 by Caroline Osborne in Leicester, where she ran her Pet Beautician's business from, and it was also a home and that she would have walked out of on that fateful day at about 6 p.m. on Friday, July the 29th of 1983, before she was murdered by Bostock. I shall show you the actual route that Caroline would have taken on that fateful night, with key reference points along the way, finishing at an area called Pebble Beach on the Elston Meadows, where Caroline's body was found 15 feet down an embankment. I will also visit the location where Amanda Weedon was murdered, close to a house known as the Chantry, which is now a residential care home on Chantry Lane between Groby Road Hospital and Gilrose Cemetery on the outskirts of the City of Leicester. And finally, I shall visit Gilrose Cemetery in the City of Leicester, where Caroline Osborne was laid to rest in 1983 and where Bostock abducted, murdered his second victim, Amanda Weedon. In 1985, 2 years after Bostock had murdered Caroline Osborne, he was visiting her grave when Amanda Weedon decided to take a shortcut, having just met her fiancée in Leicester Town Centre for a shopping trip. Bostock abducted and murdered Amanda next to this red brick house on Chantry Lane, just off Groby Road on the outskirts of the City of Leicester. Now, I could not find any records online for Amanda Weedon's grave in terms of the cemetery or the location of the cemetery. I'm assuming therefore that the family wished to keep her burial location private and out of the public domain. So, back in 1983, when Bostock attended this building, it was called Westcote Secondary School. And this is the rear entrance to the building The bottom windows, there was a hall immediately behind that, and then classrooms, and the top again was a hall with classrooms behind it. So this would have been an entrance that Bostock would have gone in 1982-83 when he was at school, when he murdered Caroline Osborne. Tudor Thomas was the headmaster. The school was closed in 1984, nothing to do with the murders, but due to a lack of funding. So it stopped being Westcote School in 1984, a school that both Bostock and I attended. I left in 82, so I'm assuming Bostock left in 82 or 83. So here we are, guys. This is Walton Street, where Paul Bostock lived in 1983 when he committed the first murder at just 16 years old. Now, to give you a couple of reference points, Westcote School that I just showed you is 2 streets away, and the house he lived in is the one with the satellite dish out. I will go to it actually because there's quite a few, but it was actually 84. So reference points, the school's obviously 2 streets away, and behind me 4 streets away is where Caroline Osborne lived and had her Pet Beautician's business on the corner of Danvers Road and Lambert Road that we'll go and see. And then obviously we'll retrace her steps to where she was actually murdered, and body was found on July the 29th of 1983. So this was the actual house that Bostock lived in, number 84, with the stone cladding and the satellite dish in 1983 with his grandma, Mrs. Olive Weir, when he murdered Caroline Osborne. Now, after the first murder was committed, Mrs. Olive Weir moved to Beaumont Leys, an area in Leicester, to Blakesley Walk, and obviously that's where he committed the second murder of Amanda Weedon, which is close to Beaumont Leys at Gilrose Cemetery. So that's the connection, and they're the reference points. So that was the house that Paul Bostock lived in, who murdered the 2 women. So if we discuss the first murder firstly, that of Caroline Osborne in 1983. 33-year-old Caroline Osborne loved animals and ran a dog grooming shop out of a home in Leicester. All who knew her said she was quiet and reserved and loved discussing dogs. So this is where Caroline Osborne lived and ran her Pet Beautician's business from in 1983. And she would have walked out that door on the left hand side on Saturday, July the 29th, about 6 p.m. and walked to the end of the road there. Now, their new houses, they weren't there, and behind those new houses you've got the Great Central Way, which leads on to the canal where Caroline would have walked, and we're going to do that route in a minute, and we'll have to go a different way. But in 1983, as I say, those houses weren't there, so they're relatively new build. But that was the location where poor Caroline, aged just 33, would have walked out on July the 29th, and that would have been her last night alive on earth. In November of 1983, Caroline travelled with a friend on a safari to Kenya, and she became so enamoured with the country that she decided to move there. And shortly after returning to England, she advertised her home and a business for sale and began taking flying lessons at a local aero club. At about 6 p.m. on Friday, July the 29th, 1983, Caroline finished her work at the business, and her neighbours saw her approximately half an hour later leaving the back of a shop to exercise her 2 dogs. Another witness saw her shortly afterwards heading towards Elston Meadows, her usual spot for walking the dogs, and police were left to speculate as to what happened next. They believe she went over Freeman's Meadow towpath bridge, as she always did, which would have taken her past St Mary's Mill Lock. From there, it was thought she took a towpath towards Elston Meadows. At this point, a witness saw a woman who may have been Caroline being chased by a man. If it is in fact her, then this will be the last time anyone saw her alive. At approximately 7:10 p.m, Caroline's black Labrador was seen heading for home. Now, Caroline had 2 dogs with her that night, and according to Dr. Roger Mugford, an animal psychologist from the University of Pennsylvania with many degrees in the discipline, he stated the dogs had an understanding with each other One dog remained with Caroline's body, the brindle retriever that belonged to a neighbour of Caroline's, whilst the other dog, a black Labrador, went back to the business on Danvers Road, sitting outside of the premises, searching for help. Very clever understanding and collusive behaviour between the dogs, according to Dr. Roger Mugford. Neighbours in turn noticed the black Labrador dog lying fatigued outside of the shop unattended and became very concerned. One of them went searching for Caroline, but finally called the police at about 10:30 that evening, and they failed to find her. The next day, an officer found her body on a waste ground in Elston Meadows. She had been stabbed to death over 10 times in the neck, arms and chest, and according to the coroner's report, the neighbour's dog Jenny, whom Caroline had been walking the day before, had guarded the corpse all night. More than 15,000 people were interviewed by Leicestershire police in the bid to find the killer. It's the Great Central Way where Caroline would have come with those two dogs, probably this way, on Saturday, July the 29th. And this is a jitty that was definitely there in 1983 where she would have walked up. That leads to the canal that ultimately leads to Pebble Beach where she was murdered and her body was found. Looking down the jitty heading towards the canal, which we'll go to. Here's the jitty, guys, that we just came down, and I'll pan around. It's an old railway bridge there, and here's the Grand Union Canal. You can hear the birds chattering away. So this is the footbridge that Caroline would have walked over, and it takes us by St Mary's Mill Lock, and then we veer right to Elston Meadows and Pebble Beach where she was murdered and the body found. So we'll go there. St Mary's Mill Lock, guys, and it features on the thumbnail, which is the first image you see of my video before and if you decide to click on it. So it's on the Grand Union Canal, and we know that Caroline would have walked by there. She would have had to get to Pebble Beach, and this is the way she would have came. So again, looking up towards Elston Meadows, that's St Mary's Mill Lock, and she would have followed this footpath, and we've got another bridge coming up, and once across that she would have veered right. So I'll show you that again, and that takes us to Pebble Beach. So this is the footbridge here, guys, and I'll just zoom in on that sign. You can see it says Elston Meadows, and that's where Caroline would have veered right to Pebble Beach, and so we'll go up there. Kathleen would have turned right heading towards Pebble Beach, so we'll just go up there. Top of that footpath, guys, is where the Elston Meadows sign was, and if I just pan around, we're just coming up to Pebble Beach just on the right hand side. So this, guys, is what we call, or where we call, Pebble Beach, and this is where Caroline Osborne was murdered by Bostock, and her body was found, they said, at the bottom of a 15-foot embankment. Now behind those trees in the middle of the screen there's an embankment, so I'm going to suggest that I think that's where her body would have been found. So this is it. This was the final place that poor Caroline spent alive on earth. July 29. It was a Saturday in 1983, the middle of the summer. A really nice, beautiful spot for such a heinous act to be committed and be robbed of a life. Right, guys, we're retracing the steps that Amanda Weedon would have taken on that fateful night in 1985 when she was sadly murdered by Paul Bostock. So this is what we call Chantry Lane, and it would have been a shortcut for Amanda, who was basically walking up here, just having met a boyfriend, her fiancé to be, Mr. Eversfield. They were getting married in 3 months' time, moving into their house in 2 days' time. Now, there used to be a city hospital on the right hand side as you look at the picture, and it's now called Loros. It's basically a hospice for terminally ill people, but once upon a time it was, when Amanda was alive at least, it was the city hospital. And I'll show you the entrance where Amanda was accosted and murdered and stabbed 37 times by Paul Bostock, and then I'll show you the location where her body was found. Now, so this is Chantry Lane, and this is the walk that Amanda would have taken on that fateful Saturday night, and we're going to show you the entrance to the then City Hospital that Amanda would have taken to get to work. And as we said, she was a nurse, and this is where she would have come. It's very, very peaceful up here, but equally it's very isolated, so obviously an ideal opportunity for Bostock. Remember, he just visited the grave of Caroline, which was literally at the top. As we look up, the cemetery's up there, so you could walk from Gilrose Cemetery to here in about literally 10 minutes, I would say, where her grave is. So this is the original gate to the City Hospital that Amanda Weedon would have walked through. Now, there were signs at the autopsy that she had been tortured, no signs of sexual assault, but she had been stabbed 37 times ferociously. So after Bostock had basically stabbed her ferociously and killed her, her body was found at Chantry House. Now we're going back to 1983, and again I'll put the pictures up to show you what it looked like then. And there's obviously been a lot of new builds since then, but these are clearly the original railings that were around at the time, and that you'll see from the original pictures. This wooden fencing is clearly very new, but we'll show you where, and again I'll put pictures up, Chantry House was and where a body was found. She's 21 years old. Absolute tragedy. So this is Chantry House. I can't show the original building because I'll just try and pan up over the fence. So there's Chantry House. You can see the top of the ridge there, and this wooden fencing is obviously new, but that's the original structure, and this is where Amanda's body would have been found in 1985. As already stated, Bostock's grandmother, a Mrs. Olive Weir, whom Bostock had been living with on Walton Street in 1983 when he committed the first murder of Caroline Osborne in that same year when he was just 16 years old, had now moved to a place called Blakesley Walk in the Beaumont Leys area of Leicester with his grandmother Olive Weir again, which was close to the second murder victim, Amanda Weedon. When the police's description of potential suspects came out on the news, Olive said to Paul Bostock, "That sounds like you, Paul. You ought to go to the police to clear your name." Now, Bostock was a big strapping 18-year-old by now, 6'5" tall and 15 stone. When the police interviewed Bostock, they were very suspicious of his story and subsequently searched his grandmother's address at Blakesley Walk. They in turn found pictures and posters of ritual tortures, murders, various martial arts weapons, and a most damning piece of evidence was in a 1984 diary written on the pages for the 28th and 29th of July 1984, and I quote, "anniversary 1 year," exactly 1 year to the date of the death of Caroline Osborne. Now, Bostock was a sexual sadist with an unhealthy interest in black magic, knives and the occult. And at his trial, Mr. Justice Tucker said about Bostock, he was a very dangerous young man, and so in June of 1986, Paul Kenneth Bostock was convicted of Caroline Osborne's murder as well as that of Amanda Weedon in 1985, and he was jailed for life. And bizarrely, everyone who knew him said, and I quote, he was a gentle giant. And the former headmaster at Westcote Secondary Modern School, where Bostock attended, a man by the name of Tudor Thomas, said, and I quote, he was a nice boy, popular, conscientious, the most unlikely character to be involved in something like this. We're at the final resting place of Caroline Osborne here at Gilrose Cemetery who was the first victim of Paul Bostock. She was murdered on 29th of July 1983 at the tender age of just 33 years old. Treasured memories of a loving wife and daughter, Caroline Osborne nee Smith, died 29th of July 1983, aged 33 years. And George Abraham Smith died 1st of August 1996, aged 84 years, in remembrance of beloved father, grandfather and friend. Rest in peace, Caroline. We'll now talk about the release of Paul Bostock from prison. Now, Paul Bostock went before parole board in August of 2020, having been incarcerated since 1986. In September of 2020, Bostock was released from prison to much public outcry, especially from the Weedon family. Amanda's brother Martin fought tooth and nail to try to ensure Bostock was not released. Paul Bostock had been sentenced on the 1st of January 1986 and spent a total of 34 years, 9 months and 20 days in prison. The official end of his sentence was on the 21st of October 2020. The Weedon family were in turn able to read a statement to the parole board hearing earlier that year to explain why they believed Bostock would always pose a risk to the public, particularly women. Despite this, the board went on to clear him for release. Mr. Weedon added on a quote, "You try to avoid being consumed by anger, but it is always there. We just don't believe this man should be out. We took it as far as we could, but there was nothing more we could do to stop his release." End of quote. Amanda's family, led by her father Horace Weedon, repeatedly spoke out against Bostock's bids for freedom. However, Mr. Weedon passed away in age 92 in March of that year. And Martin, 61, took on responsibility for the family's campaign of blocking Bostock's bid for parole and keeping his sister's name alive. Now, Bostock will be monitored by an electronic tag and he must observe a daily curfew. And Bostock is not allowed in any of the East Midland counties of Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire or Derbyshire. So that concludes the video, guys. Thank you for watching. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Can offenders like Bostock ever be rehabilitated? Should they be allowed back in society after they've served their sentence? Please add a comment in the comments box below. Thank you for watching.